Most people make music when they're happy. Michael Jackson made his greatest music when he was destroyed. Los Angeles, 1994. The trial was over. The settlement had been signed. The headlines had moved on to other scandals, other celebrities, other tragedies. The machine that had consumed Michael Jackson for the better part of 2 years had found new things to eat. And Michael was left alone with what remained. What remained was not what anyone expected. It was not defeat. It was not silence. It was not the quiet disappearance of a man who had been broken by the machinery of public opinion and legal proceedings and relentless, merciless media coverage. What remained was fury. Quiet, precise, devastating fury. The kind that doesn't shout. The kind that picks up a pen and a microphone and says, "I am going to show you exactly what you did to me. And I am going to make it so beautiful and so powerful that you will never be able to look away." Michael Jackson went into the studio, and he made history. To understand history, you have to understand what 1993 had done to him. You already know the facts, the allegations, the investigation, the settlement, the headlines that ran in every language on every continent, that turned his name from a symbol of joy into a question mark. But facts don't capture what it felt like. Facts don't capture what it means to be the most famous person on Earth and have the entire world decide, essentially overnight, that everything you are and everything you've built is suspect. Michael had spent his entire life trying to be good, not just successful. Good. The charity work, the Neverland gates open to sick children, the belief that art could heal and connect and lift people up. All of it rooted in a genuine, almost childlike conviction that goodness was possible and that he was part of it. 1993 had taken that conviction and ground it into dust. He emerged from that year not knowing who he was anymore. Not in the existential way that phrase is usually used, in a literal, practical, daily way. The person the world now thought he was, the person described in those headlines, bore no resemblance to the person he knew himself to be. And the gap between those two people was so vast, so unbridgeable, that living inside it was its own kind of violence. But here's what was truly shocking. Instead of breaking him, that gap became the album. He married Lisa Marie Presley in May 1994. The world was skeptical. The tabloids were merciless. The marriage between the king of pop and the daughter of Elvis Presley was treated as a publicity stunt, as damage control, as anything other than what it appeared to be. Two deeply complicated people finding each other in the ruins of their respective inheritances. Lisa Marie Presley, years later, would say things about Michael that cut through all the noise. She would say that she had genuinely loved him, that he had been, in private, a completely different person than the person the world thought it knew, that the gap between the public Michael and the private Michael was the loneliest thing she had ever witnessed. Michael was making history during this period. He was writing songs in hotel rooms and studios in the back of cars. He was recording at odd hours, calling producers at 3 in the morning with ideas, working with the same obsessive intensity that had always defined him, but now with something extra underneath it, something darker and more urgent. He was working like a man who had something to say and was not sure how much time he had left to say it. The album came out in June 1995. It was enormous, a double album, 1 disc of greatest hits and 1 disc of new material. The new material was what mattered. The new material was what nobody was quite prepared for. Scream was the first single, a duet with his sister Janet. It was, and remains, the most expensive music video ever made. It cost $7 million. It was filmed in black and white in a spaceship, with a production design that looked like the interior of a mind at the end of its rope. The song itself was barely contained rage. Michael and Janet screaming into the void, the lyrics raw and direct in a way that Michael had never been before. Stop pressuring me. Just stop pressuring me. People who had watched Michael Jackson perform for decades said they had never heard him sound quite like that before. Not angry, exactly, though the anger was there. Something more desperate. Something that sounded like a man who had been pushed to the absolute limit of what a human being can absorb and had decided, finally, to push back. This is the moment everything changed, because Michael Jackson was no longer performing for the world. He was talking to it. "They don't care about us," came next. This one landed differently. This was not the contained fury of "Scream." This was something wilder and more dangerous. A thundering indictment of injustice, of the machinery of power, of the way the world treats people who don't have the resources to protect themselves. The video was filmed in two versions, one in the favelas of Rio de Janeiro and one in a Brazilian prison. The director was Spike Lee. The images were of poverty and oppression and systemic neglect. Real faces, real places, real suffering. Michael was using his platform in a way he had never used it before. Not to inspire, not to entertain, not to heal, but to indict, to point at something ugly and refuse to look away. Some people were made uncomfortable by this. Some critics said it was self-indulgent, that Michael was conflating his own experience with the suffering of people who had genuine, material oppression to contend with. Michael heard those criticisms and responded by doing the opposite of whatever he was told. Don't miss this, because buried in the middle of history was a song that nobody talked about as much as the others, but that said more about who Michael Jackson really was than any of the angrier tracks. Stranger in Moscow. This is the one. If you want to understand where Michael Jackson was in 1995, you don't need to read the interviews or study the court documents or parse the legal filings. You just need to listen to Stranger in Moscow. The song is quiet, almost unbearably quiet. A spare piano figure, a muted beat, Michael's voice stripped of all the pyrotechnics and vocal acrobatics that had always been his signature. He is singing simply. He is singing as if the performance mask has finally been removed. He sings about walking through the rain alone, about feeling watched, about feeling hunted, about the KGB and political exile as metaphors for what it feels like to be the subject of the world's suspicion. But it's not really about the KGB. Everyone knows it's not about the KGB. It's about what it feels like to live inside a fame so enormous that it becomes its own prison. To be the most recognized face on earth and feel completely, utterly, profoundly alone. The song ends not with resolution, but with continuation. The rain keeps falling. The stranger keeps walking. There is no redemption at the end, no triumphant chord, no promise that things will get better. Just the rain and the loneliness and the footsteps. Michael Jackson wrote, "Stranger in Moscow, alone, in a hotel room, during the 1993 Dangerous World Tour, in the middle of everything falling apart." He sat down at a keyboard and wrote about how he felt. And what came out was one of the most honest pieces of music he ever made. The history era was also the era of the most elaborate, most expensive, most visually overwhelming artistic statement of Michael Jackson's career. The history teaser. Not a music video, not a trailer, a 4-minute short film, a piece of visual art disguised as a commercial, in which Michael Jackson was depicted as a military figure, a monument, a colossus, being celebrated in a vast public ceremony that looked like the rallies of totalitarian states. It was controversial, enormously, predictably, deliberately controversial. Some people saw it as megalomania, as Michael Jackson losing touch with reality and depicting himself as a god. Some critics tore it apart as the most extreme example yet of a celebrity ego run completely amok. But others, people who looked more carefully, who listened to what Michael said about it, saw something else. They saw a provocation. They saw a man who had been accused of the most serious crimes imaginable, who had watched the world convict him in the court of public opinion before any evidence had been examined, who had felt the full weight of the media's capacity for destruction. They saw that man looking directly at his accusers and saying, "You want a monster. I'll give you a monster. Let's talk about what a real abuse of power looks like." The history teaser was not Michael Jackson saying he was a god. It was Michael Jackson saying, "Look at what you've made me." You haven't seen the biggest surprise yet, because the History album was not just a response to 1993. It was a map of Michael Jackson's interior world that he had never allowed anyone to see before. Earth Song. This one arrived like something from a different dimension entirely. A 6-minute meditation on ecological destruction, on human suffering, on the casual violence that civilization inflicts on the natural world. A choir. A build that starts in near silence and ends in something that sounds like the end of the world and the beginning of something else simultaneously. Michael had been working on Earth Song for years. It had existed in various forms since the late 1980s, but it found its home on History, where it stood as the album's moral center, the place where the personal fury of Scream and the political anger of "They don't care about us" expanded into something universal. He performed Earth Song at the 1996 Brit Awards. The performance is legendary, a vast theatrical spectacle with a Christ-like imagery that left no one in doubt about what Michael thought he was doing and what he thought was at stake. Jarvis Cocker from Pulp invaded the stage during the performance in protest. The image of Michael, arms outstretched, surrounded by children and the staging of a resurrection, while a skinny British indie musician danced mockingly in the background, became one of the defining images of that era. Michael didn't break character. He kept performing. He held the pose. He had made his statement, and he was not going to let anyone take it from him. The thing about history, the thing that becomes clearer with distance, is that it is the work of a man who has nothing left to lose. By 1995, Michael Jackson had already been through the thing he had most feared, the destruction of his public image, the dismantling of the story he had told about himself, the world deciding that the goodness he had worked his entire life to project was either fraudulent or irrelevant. That had already happened. The worst had come, and it had not killed him. And so he made an album. Not an album designed to win people back, not a calculated attempt at rehabilitation. An album that said exactly what he thought, felt exactly what he felt, pointed at exactly the things he wanted to point at, and refused, absolutely refused, to be palatable. He put Stranger in Moscow on it. He put Earth Song on it. He put They Don't Care About Us on it. He put Scream on it. He also put You Are Not Alone on it. a song of such naked vulnerability that it seemed almost impossible that the same person who made Scream could have made it. But that was the point. That was Michael Jackson. He was all of those things simultaneously: the fury and the tenderness, the political and the personal, the overwhelming and the quiet. History contained all of it. It was the most complete self-portrait he ever painted. The album sold 20 million copies. You Are Not Alone became the first single in history to debut at #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. The History World Tour ran from 1996 to 1997, 82 concerts, 58 cities, over 4.5 million people. Michael Jackson, the man who had been left for dead by the media and the public in 1993, had come back. Not quietly, not apologetically, not with his hat in his hand asking for forgiveness. He had come back with an album that was essentially a 40-song argument that the world had gotten him wrong. And the world, to its credit, listened. But here's the part of the story that gets lost in the sales figures and the tour statistics. In 1997, during the History World Tour, Michael Jackson became a father. His son, Michael Joseph Jackson Jr., Prince, was born in February 1997. His daughter Paris was born the following year. And something changed. The people around Michael during that period describe a transformation that was almost physical. The fury that had driven history, the urgency and the anger and the need to make the world hear him. That didn't disappear, but it found a counterweight. He had someone to be good for now. Not the public, not the critics, not the jury of global opinion. Someone specific and small and completely dependent on him. Michael Jackson, who had never had a real childhood, was determined to give his children one. He was determined to be the father that he had never had, to say the things that nobody had said to him, to create, in his own home, the Neverland that Neverland had always been trying to be. He was largely successful at this. The children he raised, by all the accounts of the people who knew them, by the words Paris herself spoke at his memorial, were children who knew they were loved, unconditionally, without performance, without requirement. And just when you thought the story was heading somewhere darker, this is the real surprise. The last song on History is called History. Not one of the well-known tracks, not a single. A spoken word piece, essentially. Michael's voice over a sparse musical backdrop, speaking directly to the listener. He talks about what he wants to be remembered for. Not the albums, not the tours, not the moonwalk or the videos or the records or the awards. He talks about his children. He talks about love. He talks about the possibility, still, of goodness, even after everything. It is the quietest thing on an album full of noise, and it is the truest. The man who began history in the wreckage of 1993, furious and wounded and barely intact, ended it with a statement of faith. Not religious faith, though that was present too. Faith in the possibility that the world could be better than it had been to him. That the love he had tried to give was worth giving even when it was not returned. He kept believing that until the end. History was released on June 20th, 1995. 30 years later, Stranger in Moscow still sounds like the most honest thing anyone has ever said about fame. Earth Song still sounds like a warning we haven't heeded. Scream still sounds like a cry that was heard and ignored. And Michael Jackson, the man who made these things in the wreckage of the worst years of his life, is still, somehow, everywhere. In the moonwalk that children still try in living rooms, in the songs that still play at weddings and funerals and everything in between, in the way a melody can carry a feeling across decades and deliver it, intact, to someone who wasn't even born when it was recorded. He turned his pain into music, and the music outlasted the pain. In a world filled with hate, we must still dare to hope. In a world filled with anger, we must still dare to comfort. In a world filled with despair, we must still dare to dream. And in a world filled with distrust, we must still dare to believe. Michael Jackson.